This week we are talking about freight for 2024. Coming right up. So why are we talking about freight for 2024, and particularly road freight? Well, I've been traveling around quite a bit recently, talking to some of our consulting clients at Logistics Bureau. I've been up in Southeast Asia, I've been over in Western Australia, traveling around on the east coast of Australia, and I've noticed a few themes coming up when we've been talking about road freight. So I just wanted to give you a few tips to things to look at, if you like, on your road freight for 2024. And these are common things that people are having challenges with. So this is not, like a masterclass on freight, but a few things to check out. If you need some help sorting out your freight, I'll put some links down below. I'll talk about that in a minute. But let's hit on 6 things that I reckon you ought to be looking at in terms of your road freight for the coming year ahead. First of all, the number of carriers. This is a tricky one. So I'm based in Australia. A lot of countries around the world, you're probably going to have similar issues in Canada, North America, Europe to a certain extent. But one of the challenges that we have here in Australia is that it's very difficult to get one freight carrier to look after all of your needs nationally. So, let's say I'm in Sydney. If I've got a company based in Sydney and I want people doing deliveries all over the country, that's quite hard because they've got to have a capability to get into remote areas. They've got to be able to get across to the west coast, which is it's a 4-hour flight to get there. I was there the other week. And so it's very hard to get one national carrier to do all of that. And you might be watching this and saying, oh yes, but I've got one. But I would bet you that they've got a lot of subcontractors doing some of the more remote areas and areas that their core fleet doesn't service. So the question in a lot of people's mind is how many carriers is the right number and how many is too many? Look, it's very much dependent on the type of business, the type of service that you're providing, the turnaround times for orders and all this kind of thing. But let me give you some brackets. So some of the companies I've been talking with, don't laugh, have upwards of 100 carriers, and it's a lot more than 100. And you would have to say, is that a good thing? How does that possibly come about? It generally comes about because the management of freight has been decentralized. So if you imagine you have a very big branch network, branch managers are organizing their own freight, they're dealing with local freight companies, and that's all great. They may have had long relationships with those people and get on really well and so on. But if you're in procurement, you would know that that's really not the best way to manage freight from a national perspective, because a lot of those branch managers might be dealing with the same carriers. They might have different rate structures, different rates, different services. You're missing out on buying power because maybe, in a certain region you're using 4 or 5 different carriers, whereas you could centralize or rationalize onto one and get much better rates. So there's not a lot of sense generally in using that number of carriers, but that's why it happens. So I was talking to a big distributor the other day who has that situation, and they said, oh, it's a bit of a change management thing because the branch managers have always traditionally managed their own freight, and it's, we don't want to upset that upper cart because they have a lot of autonomy in how they operate, and yeah, it's a challenge. But he recognised that over time they want to start rationalising that because there's a huge cost-saving opportunity and a service benefit. Okay, so that's that extreme. Can you get away with 1 or 2? I'll look for national distribution. I think that's pretty hard. As I mentioned, they're probably going to utilise a lot of subcontractors. So, 2, 3, 4, certainly in Australia is very common, unless you've got what is termed a lead logistics provider or a lead transport company who is managing the whole thing for you and managing your subcontractors. So number 1, look at the number of carriers you've got and ask yourself, is this reasonable? Are we getting the most benefit in terms of cost and service? Is it creating a lot of admin because we have so many carriers? And maybe think about, if you've got a lot, maybe think about rationalising those during 2024. Number 2, and it's kind of linked with this decentralised thing in number 1. Number 2 is how long have you had those relationships with those freight carriers? So again, not sort of casting dispersions on anyone here, But I've talked to a number of people who have, for example, had the same freight carriers for 15 years. Now, on the one hand, I'd say that's great because you have that fantastic relationship. You understand each other's businesses really well. Why would you want to go and change something that's not broken? And I absolutely get that and would agree with that. Where I have a slight issue, though, is if you haven't really lifted the hood on that relationship in 15 years and had a good dig around at the service and the rates, maybe done a little bit of market testing, see what's out there, because like any relationship, long-term relationship, the danger is it can get a little bit stale, a little bit complacent. You might be missing out on some innovation. So I would always say, have a look around. I'm not saying get divorced from your freight carrier. I'm saying, have a look around, see what else is out there. Make sure that the relationship is still commercially competitive, that the service is right, that you're getting the right technology, and so on. What some companies do, and I'm not a great fan of this either, is that they will go to the market every 3 years or so and test the market and get quotes and put a lot of transport companies through the grind to provide quotes, and then they'll end up staying with their current carrier or whatever. That's a lot of work for you and for those transport companies. There are easier and better ways, I think, that you can check the market. You can do some benchmarking. We do this with a lot of our clients. We'll benchmark their transport rates and see, is it worth changing? Are you doing really well with your freight? You can actually, if you really want to go to the market, you don't have to go through a complete request for a proposal. You can do an expression of interest, which is a lot less work for the carriers to have to do. So there's a number of ways to do that. But if you've had that very long-term relationship and never really examined it for a few years, I would say do have a look. Number 3, ownership. This actually came up at dinner with a client the other day, and we were talking about some specialised transport that was being utilised on particular legs for national distribution. There's a tendency to either have in-house transport, where you're running you own the trucks, you're employing the drivers, or maybe you've got contract drivers, or you've got the whole thing outsourced to a freight company. There's a hybrid, and very often it makes a lot of sense if you've got specialized vehicles, if you've got very high utilization of vehicles. And I've seen this in a few industries where, if you can imagine, there's a milk run going from A to B, B to A to B, B to A. It's going full with one product, it's being backloaded with maybe raw materials, and it's just going round and round and round. And I've worked with a few companies like that over the years where it was a 24-hour operation just going round and round and round. You've got 10, 20 vehicles doing that. It might make sense to actually run that part yourself, or to own the assets and have someone manage them for you. So just consider those sort of hybrid options. You don't have to have a blanket solution which is all in-house, all outsourced. Sometimes it can make sense to have that hybrid. Number 4, getting back to the outsourced again, and I've talked about this a lot on the channel, look at rate structures. So if you're trying to reduce your transport costs, it comes down to a couple of things. One is make the task simpler. Let me just explain that for a minute. So if you are presenting your freight to a carrier in such a way that it's difficult to handle, we can't double stack it, it's utilizing more space than it needs to on the vehicle, you're ending up paying for that. So try to present your freight in a way that makes it very easy for the freight company to handle it. That's number 1. And then closely linked to that is the rate structure. So a lot of people get very twisted about the actual rate. We're paying $20 a pallet, $50 a pallet, $400 a pallet in some areas in Australia, and they get fixated on that. But look at the rate structure. So by that I mean, are you paying per pallet space, per cube? Are you paying a weight break? Have a look at the breaks on your rate structure as well. So if you're paying a pallet rate, for example, you might be paying a certain amount between 1 and 4 pallets, and then you're paying a different amount if it's between 5 and 10 pallets, and then you're paying a different amount if it's between 10 and 15 pallets. And there's more videos about this on the channel. Make sure that those weight breaks or those volume breaks actually work in your favor. It's no good having a fantastic rate in the 5 to 10 pallet break if none of your orders are that size. They're all going as single pallets or they're all going as full truckloads. So look at the rate structure, what you're actually paying, how you're paying, not whether it's the $20 or $50, it's how that rate is actually structured. So that's number 4. Number 5, asset utilization. So look at the transport assets that are being provided to you and make sure that those are getting really well utilized in terms of time and space, volumetric capacity. And again, if you think back to my earlier comment, which was number 2, about the longevity or the amount of time that you've had this freight contract in place, your requirements may have changed over time, but maybe your freight carrier hasn't changed their equipment over time to match your new needs. And so if you've got assets that are being used which are not quite suited to your needs, and I've seen this recently with some work that we've done in Western Australia in the mining sector, where the trucks are not being well utilised in terms of weight and cubic capacity because the need has changed over time, but the fleet is the same fleet. And so it's not as cost effective as it could be. So I'm not suggesting for a minute you go to your transport company and get them to change their fleet every 6 months. But maybe over a period of a number of years, the need has changed slightly. And when they're updating their fleet, maybe you work with them and say, well, these sorts of vehicles are probably going to give us better utilisation, better cost, and so on. So have a look at the asset utilisation. And then number 6, the final one I would say, is get into the nitty-gritty of the contract terms. I'm surprised there's actually still quite a lot of freight being carried around that is not contracted, and by that I mean it's just a casual sort of day-to-day relationship. Might have been going on for years, but there's no sort of formal contract in place. Some of the things to look for, is not just the rates and the payment terms and the KPIs and all that sort of stuff, but things like the fuel surcharges, looking at labour rates, all those sort of elements that can add cost to your freight bill. So do have a look at the contract terms and go through those with a fine-tooth comb. So there we go, 6 things to look at in your freight for 2024. Let's just quickly summarize them. It was how many carriers have you got? How long has the relationship been running? Is it time to lift the hood and have a look? Are there elements of your transport tasks that would make a lot more sense to have in-house? Have a look at the rate structure. Have a look at the asset utilisation, the equipment that's being used, and do have a look at those contract terms. Look at the fine print and make sure that it's appropriate for your needs. So there you go. If you need to know anything else about freight contracts, do comment down below, do ask questions. If you need some help with your freight contracts during 2024, that's kind of what we do here at Logistics Bureau. I'll put a link in the description under the video where you can make direct contact and talk to somebody and maybe get some of your questions answered, get a few tips. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye for now.